I'm Mark Golub, and as we continue here on JBS to look at election 2016 with an emphasis on issues of Jewish concern, some new controversy has emerged as we move towards the upcoming primaries in the state of New York. Most specifically, the controversy centers on comments made by Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders when he met with the editorial board of the New York Daily News. During that meeting, Senator Sanders was unequivocal in his commitment to the future of Israel, saying, "I believe 100% not only in Israel's right to exist, a right to exist in peace and security without having to face terrorist attacks." However, Sanders then went on to call Israel's actions during the 2014 war in Gaza disproportionate, saying, "My recollection is over 10,000 innocent people were killed in Gaza." Of course, that number 10,000 has absolutely no basis in reality. Even Hamas's inflated number of civilian victims is some 5 times less. But Sanders' view of Israel has caused some real concern in the Jewish community. For example, the new national CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, issued a statement calling on Senator Sanders to correct his misstatements. Well, for some insight and analysis on this issue, as well as on both election primaries in general, I'm so pleased to have on our JBS phones once again the senior online editor of Commentary, the preeminent neoconservative monthly magazine in the Jewish community, Jonathan Tobin. And Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Great to be back with you, Mark.
So, Jonathan, how serious is the Bernie Sanders mistake in which he blames Israel for killing 10,000 innocent civilians during the war in Gaza?
Well, it's rather astonishing on its face because Sanders is someone who sits in the Senate. He's not an amateur politician. He's a professional politician. He follows these things. And to get the numbers that wrong,
yes,
he speaks something more than just, well, I got a statistic wrong. As you say, it's 5 times more than Hamas says. It's 7 times more what even the anti-Israel UN Human Rights Council claimed. And in fact, it's much more than that, because even that number of 1,500 is probably double the number, because half of those people were almost certainly Hamas personnel,
yes.
Terrorists of one sort or another.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just wrong. Now, what was really troubling is that it sort of takes the point of view, Sanders took the point of view that, yes, Israel has the right to defend itself. He supports Israel's right to exist. But he doesn't seem to be in favor of exercising that right to defend itself, because he claimed that, well, Israel could have used technology to take someone's nose off, and that therefore there's no excuse for killing so many innocent civilians, when in fact he doesn't take into account the difficulties of fighting in an area where Hamas is using civilians as human shields. I mean, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, described Israel's conduct in Gaza as a role model for American troops, who, quite frankly, don't have as restrictive rules of engagement in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as Israel does in Gaza. So it was really an astonishing thing. But it goes a little further than that. We can harp on one misstatement, but Sanders' view on Israel are troubling because it reflects a trend within the left wing of the Democratic Party that has been increasingly critical of Israel and increasingly ambivalent about support for it. Because if you flesh out all of the other things that Sanders has said about Israel, and the peace process, he blames Israel for the lack of peace. He doesn't really give any agency to the Palestinians. He doesn't put into context. He doesn't seem to act as if he even knows that the Palestinians have repeatedly refused peace offers, including of statehood, 3 times in the last decade. And he just puts it all on Israel. And that bespeaks a very negative attitude is quite frankly worse than even President Obama's pressure on Israel. And it also speaks to, there's a trend here. Democrats, polling has shown that Democrats are less likely to be supportive of Israel. And that's especially true of younger Democrats. And those are the people that are voting for Sanders. So if you want something to worry about, is that Sanders is kind of speaking for the future of the base of the Democratic Party. That's not to say that there aren't many still pro-Israel Democrats, pro-Israel Jewish Democrats.
Of course, sure.
But there is a problem here, and it needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, Bernie has said he gets his information regarding Israel and the Middle East from J Street. And this very high number, he quotes this, almost ludicrous high number, it comes out of a certain kind of far-left mentality that wants to tar Israel with a kind of inhumane, brutalizing brush anytime it possibly can. And I'm wondering whether you see a link here between, again, some, as you say, far left, not only the Democratic Party, but within the Jewish community, and again, the J Street mentality as it has affected and influenced a presidential primary candidate.
Well, clearly, Bernie doesn't necessarily have to take his cues from J Street. Let's give him some credit. He's a long-standing member of the Jewish left himself. I don't know how much he's getting his information from them or not. Clearly, it's a blame Israel first mentality. It is one that ignores the entire context of the Middle East conflict, ignores basically everything the Palestinians do and say. There was no mention in his rather lengthy statement, as well as in the speech, that he didn't give to AIPAC. Let's remember that. That's a very interesting point, is that he was the only major party presidential candidate still in the race that didn't choose to go to AIPAC and to give his speech. And the reason for that is that he would not have gotten, even though he is the only Jewish candidate, he would not have gotten a very warm reception, because the speech that he did give out west on foreign policy to an audience in Idaho that I don't know was that interested in hearing about Israel, was, again, a very voluminous statement of blame for support for Israel's right to exist. Let's give him credit for that. But also blame for Israel, also not recognizing anything that's going on in the conflict, why it is where it is. And that brings us back to J Street. The interesting thing about J Street, there are a couple of interesting things, is that its influence is widely exaggerated, because as we've seen in year after year in the 8 years of the Obama administration, J Street has very little influence on Capitol Hill or even in the White House. When push comes to shove, even the White House knows it's got to deal with AIPAC, not J Street, despite their pretensions to leadership. But they have sort of taken a point of view that has been completely discredited in Israel. Even as they talk about defending Israeli democracy, their point of view really has almost no constituency left within the Jewish population of Israel, where left and right have united on the notion that there really isn't a peace partner right now. Even the head of the Zionist Union Labor Party, that leads the opposition to Prime Minister Netanyahu, has acknowledged there isn't going to be a two-state solution anytime in the foreseeable future, because the Palestinians don't want one. They're not willing to negotiate for one. And that is, these are basic facts that more or less everybody in Israel understands, and yet hasn't penetrated to the consciousness of the American Jewish. To the extent that Bernie Sanders represents that point of view, which is sort of dangerously out of touch, he's obviously represents a trend that is harmful for Israel and for the U.S.-Israel alliance.
It is so interesting to see how much enthusiasm there is for Bernie Sanders among many American Jews, for whom the Israel issue is not a primary issue. They're more interested in domestic policy and the social well-being, the social fabric of America. And Bernie has captured the imagination of not only young people, but a certain kind of traditionally liberal Jew. And I have respect for that liberal mentality, that liberal affection. At the same time, I'm worried, as you have just expressed, that within that community there seems to be a growing disconnect between that faction in the Jewish community and the State of Israel and support for the State of Israel. And what I wanted to also hear you comment on is how you feel in general the Jewish community is now viewing not only Bernie Sanders but Hillary Clinton. And in one moment, I'm going to ask you to comment on the entire field of candidates in both parties. But sticking just within the Democratic Party, Jonathan, when you talk to people, when you hear people, and you hear people all the time, and you hear a certain kind of intellectuals, elite, and Jewish leadership, how do you hear them talk about the comparison between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in the two areas, social domestic policy and commitment to the State of Israel?
Well, let's start with saying a basic truth about American Jewish voters. Most of them, especially the vast majority of whom are liberal, are not one-issue voters on Israel. This is a misconception that I think a lot of politicians who are not Jewish haven't caught on to, and to a certain extent that's been good for Israel. But most American Jews, the vast majority who are liberal, are not one-issue Israel
Absolutely.
voters. They care just as much, if not far more, about domestic issues. And yes of course, they like, when one speaks to liberals, we hear about how they're torn between their head and their heart, between Clinton and Sanders. Sanders' appeal, obviously, it's sort of this traditional, red meat for the red meat version for the left. To some extent, he kind of, he is the flip side of the coin with Donald Trump, if I can just invoke the Republicans, because both of them have risen to popularity this year based on anger, and with the idea that there are bad guys out there and the bad guys must be punished. Now, of course, for Donald Trump, the bad guys are the Mexicans, the Chinese, and the Muslims, and you've got to build a wall or throw them out. For Bernie Sanders, the bad guys are Wall Street and the banks. And in that same New York Daily News interview that you cited at the top of our show, he got in pretty deep in the weeds, sort of reminding everybody that he is not a mainstream, liberal Democrat. He is a socialist. And he got really into a lot of dialectic about the banks and, rhetoric that Eugene V. Debs might have been comfortable with a century ago.
Yes.
To the extent that liberal Democrats are attuned to political realities or wise to the sort of rhetorical tricks that politicians play, I think, the more responsible of them look to Clinton as the the one who is prepared to be president, who knows what she's talking about to some extent, for all of the fact that she has some real liabilities herself. But Bernie plays to the mob on that in a different way, but sort of in the same spirit which Donald Trump has been playing to a different mob.
All right, I want to talk now about New York, because you've made reference to it in both party primaries. I want to put the Democratic polls up now that show where New York stands. The Democratic poll shows that in the state of New York, Hillary has a 10-point lead, though many feel, Jonathan, it's a far smaller lead than would have been expected a week before the New York primary. If we then look at the Republican primary, Donald Trump maintains a significant lead over his two rivals in New York, though interestingly enough, Jonathan, John Kasich is in second place in New York at 25%. Trump has more than 50%, 52%, while Ted Cruz, who suggested the race was his after his upset win in Wisconsin, in New York, Ted Cruz is far behind in third place. And while we're talking about New York, we should take a look, Sloan, at Pennsylvania as well. In Pennsylvania, in the Democratic Party, Clinton has a lead again over Sanders, but not that large, 6 points in Pennsylvania. If we look at the Republican poll in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump is leading. Ted Cruz is in second place in Pennsylvania, but Cruz leads by 9% in Pennsylvania, and that is a closer race in Pennsylvania than it is at the moment in New York. So, Jonathan, there are a lot of New York Jews. Whom do you expect New York Jews to vote for in these upcoming primaries?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think obviously New York Jews are going to be split. In general, Clinton's strength is in the African American community.
Right.
In any state that is ethnically diverse, racially diverse rather, she's winning because African American voters are her firewall. The sort of socialist claptrap that Bernie spouts and which the left-wing base of the Democratic Party loves doesn't play as well among African Americans who don't trust him. So there's sort of, these factors are going to play into it. Now, New York Jews, are they going to stay loyal for Hillary or succumb to the Bernie temptation? I think they're going to be split. And I think they reflect Hillary's problem. Hillary is just a terrible candidate. I mean, for all the fact that she should have had this, she is the consensus pick of her party. The nomination is really locked up because of the superdelegates, and yet she can't put Bernie away because he says what the Democratic base wants, and I think Jewish votes will reflect that.
All right, how about on the Republican side?
On the Republican side,
hold on one second. As you begin talking about that, I want you to begin by telling me what you understand the attitude to be among Jewish Republicans to Donald Trump.
I think it's largely very negative.
Negative.
Obviously he has a factor. There is some support there, but the basic Trump demographic of angry white males does not necessarily fit into those who call themselves Jewish Republicans.
Okay, and what about his...
Who would have tended to be more on the mainstream side, back somebody like Rubio or even Jeb Bush. They're the ones who are reconciling themselves perhaps to Ted Cruz. And Cruz has to deal with this, the reminder of his New York values crack from January, which not only is a way for Trump to remind people that he's from New York, it's also a way for him to remind all Republicans that of the things that they didn't like about Ted Cruz to begin with. However, for the majority of Republicans, if the polls and if the votes that have been counted so far, who don't really want Donald Trump, they have to decide, what they're going to do. And Cruz really is the only viable alternative to him if you look at the delegate count, if you look at other states around the union. And in fact, he has done better. He's tried to transcend his sort of televangelist pose of the early days of this race. We'll have to see whether he can do that, pick off some delegates in New York and sort of make a dent in Trump. Obviously, if Trump romps in the Northeast, he's back in the driver's seat as for the Republican nomination. And that's something that the majority of Republicans, and I would dare say the majority of Jewish Republicans, are very uneasy about because of his dog whistling about racism, his extremism, the thuggish behavior that he's exhibited in the last few weeks, and for which the Wisconsin vote showed some accountability. And as well as the fact that he's probably, if you're just going to do it straight on Israel, although Trump read a very good speech at the AIPAC convention, as it's the only speech that he's given in this entire race where he was reading from a teleprompter rather than ad-libbing, which calls into question what he actually believes and what he doesn't believe. Cruz, whatever sort of northeastern sort of mainstream Republicans may think about his reputation for extremism, he is probably the most down-the-line pro-Israel politician in the race right now. There's no question. I've talked with him. He's very secure on that issue, and I think he's going to get some support from the New York Jewish community on that.
Okay,
to the extent that they're Republicans.
You mentioned Trump at AIPAC. It's interesting. Trump did read from a teleprompter. It's not like I thought. We were covering the speech live here on JBS, but we had people in the hall, and they thought he won the crowd over. But at one point, he goes off script with that famous yay comment, which evoked a universal standing ovation, even, Jonathan, from among people who would never dream of voting for Donald Trump. And after Wisconsin, the pundits are saying he's dead. from your perspective, is Donald Trump's run for the Republican nomination, is it dead? Is it over?
Of course, it's not over. I mean, he's got a big lead. If he wins 60 to 70% of the remaining delegates, he's going to be the nominee.
Is he likely
Is
to
he
do
in
that?
trouble? That's a different question. He's not dead. He's certainly got trouble because he can't clean up his act, and he exhibits his complete ignorance of issues like foreign policy. And forget the AIPAC speech, which was a good speech. He read a good speech. But if you read the in-depth foreign policy interviews to which he was subjected to in the Washington Post and the New York Times, he has no idea what he's talking about. He wants to disband NATO. He wants to encourage Japan and South Korea to get nuclear weapons, and is indifferent to whether they wage a war against North Korea. This is nuts. These are not responsible points of view. And, he's really not ready to be commander-in-chief. And that's what we got in the last couple of weeks is a reminder that although he speaks to that need for expressing anger, as I said, that there are bad guys, the bad guys should be punished. A lot of voters don't want nuanced policy. They want anger. They want punishment. They want emotion. That's why Hillary Clinton has such trouble with Bernie Sanders, because she's talking like Jeb Bush. Mm-hmm. But Trump is still in a position where he could be the nominee. But I would say this: if he does not secure the majority of Republican delegates before the convention, if he does not get that 1237 number, if he doesn't win on the first ballot, he's not going to be the nominee, because the Republican Party is just not going to go down that road, because he looks to be a landslide loser in November.
Okay.
And take down the entire party with him.
All right. We see this just a little differently, and I've been saying this over and over again in the programs I've been hosting here on JBS. I feel that there is ad hominem criticism of Trump that is really inappropriate, and it is more a media phenomenon than I believe it is a function of Trump's character. I believe that there are real reasons for people to be against Trump and feel he is totally unsuited to be president of the United States, and you've just listed some of them. But explain this to me, Jonathan. I talk to bright, sensitive, committed Jews all the time who tell me, and they see everything you see, they tell me they're going to support Donald Trump.
The problem is people, and certainly bright Jews, can fall for the same things that everybody else can fall for. We may be an Segula, but we are not immune to the same trends. People are fed up. They don't like whatever they consider to be the establishment. They want someone who will emote for them, make them feel better. They also will, probably overestimate his ability to adjust, and they listen to the noise rather than to the notes. There are good reasons. Let's just put the facts on the table. He doesn't know what he's talking about, but it's more than that. I mean, as I wrote in a piece I wrote a couple of weeks ago, sort of speaking to Trump fans who, some of whom are rational and some of whom are anti-Semitic and very irrational in the feedback that I get from them. It's like, yes, dear Trump fans, it's more than just the issues. A man who would threaten an opponent's wife, as Donald Trump did to Ted Cruz's wife, saying he's going to spill the beans on her, that's a thug. That's not a presidential candidate. And you could tell me anything you want about what you think his capabilities are. You could swear to his character. But character is deeds. His deeds are what they are.
Would you say the same thing about a candidate who would tell his representatives throughout the state of Iowa to spread the rumor that Ben Carson was out of the race in order to defeat Donald Trump in Iowa? Does it bother you that Ted Cruz's super PAC puts out a naked picture of Donald Trump's wife?
Well,
just a minute. My own feeling is the following: if one is going to be critical of Donald, if one is going to be critical of Donald Trump for this behavior, I want to point out he is reacting. And I want to hear whether you are as critical of Ted Cruz as you are of Donald Trump.
don't go there.
Why not?
That's not true.
What's not true?
That was not a Ted Cruz super PAC. It was an anti-Trump super PAC, and he did have nothing to do with that. And to put his name on it is, quite frankly, you're throwing in a red herring here.
I don't believe. I don't agree with you. Tell me about the Ben Carson.
Now, if you're
Tell
going
me
to talk
about
about Ted
Ben
Cruz,
Carson.
listen, I've been very critical of Ted Cruz. I'm not here supporting any candidate. I don't endorse candidates. I've criticized them all.
All right, I just want to hear if you're critical of Ted Cruz.
Well, if you've been reading me over the years, I've often criticized him for him leading the Republicans off the cliff during the government shutdown.
Yes.
And his New York values. Sure, there's a lot to criticize about Ted Cruz, but there's a difference. This is someone who understands. If you're talking about the quality, the difference between the two men, Cruz has made plenty of mistakes. There are lots of reasons why Republicans didn't think of him as a first, second, third, or even fourth choice.
They hate him. They loathe him.
Of course, the establishment loathes him. He's the one. Trump has sort of stolen Cruz's plan. He spent the last 4 years in the Senate running against the Senate.
Right.
And there is, listen, there's a reason why, that Cruz is a true blue conservative, and a lot of people don't like him for that. He's a young man in a hurry. There's a lot to criticize about Ted Cruz, but if you are analogizing the sort of things that Donald Trump has done, his record, his statements, this is someone who, he makes Ted Cruz, as Newt Gingrich, who is a supporter of Trump, right, and said, Donald Trump makes Ted Cruz look normal. That's the difference here. But by contrast, Ted Cruz is Abraham Lincoln. He's George Washington
that's
compared
not.
to Donald Trump's
He is not Abraham Lincoln. Jonathan, that is such a gross overstatement.
I
You
said
would
by
not normally say
comparison.
that.
I didn't say he is Abraham Lincoln.
He does not look like Abraham Lincoln. By the way, Trump has got a lot of criticism. He cannot deliver on his grandiose promises, which is probably true. But I see Ted Cruz's promises to be also grandiose and improbable. On his first day in office, he's going to repeal Obamacare. Really? He's promised to implement a flat tax and to abolish the IRS. Really? Can a president of the United States do those things, Jonathan?
Well, he can certainly do some of that.
He cannot abolish the IRS.
Again, this is about, we can criticize some of the things that Ted Cruz has said. You could say, how is it, I don't see how anybody abolishes the IRS, although that's always an applause line for conservatives, because somebody's got to collect the taxes that are still there. Can he rip up Obamacare?
No, of course he
unless he
can't.
has a Republican Senate and House that will send him the bill that he will sign. Can he do some of that? Sure.
No, but he can't.
Legislative things.
To promise this is ludicrous. It's ludicrous.
Make Mexico pay for a wall.
It is ludicrous for a presidential candidate to make those kind of promises.
And things that are magical thinking.
And that's, by the way, why, you talk about the anger. Why are people so angry at the political establishment? Because you get this nonsense all the time. And again, I am not supporting Trump here. All I'm saying is it's much more subtle and complicated than simply one guy's a racist and nobody else is. I don't believe that's at the heart of this. And I don't believe the people who are supporting Trump are bad people, are racist people, are anti-women people. Trump did not give a fascist salute when he asked people to raise their hand. And that's the kind of nonsense which I believe Americans of all stripes just respond to viscerally with a certain kind of rejection. And
Mark, of course you're right. I wrote as much.
That's right. You
fascist.
did.
He's
you
not
did.
A Nazi, but he is what he is, and what he is bad enough. The anger is fed in part by reality, and that yes, government has been dysfunctional, and it's also part by the sort of scapegoating and sort of foolish rhetoric that people on the left and the right have indulged in.
Exactly.
In which they seek boogeymen. As I said, whether, if you think it's, the Mexicans, the Chinese, and the Muslims are to blame for all our problems, or if you think it's the banks and Wall Street are responsible for all our problems. That's the kind of foolish thinking that doesn't lead us to any solutions. And I think candidates who play into that, are wrong. Trump is a different kind of politician, and unless we understand that, I mean, he's a world historical figure in that respect, in that he's taken us down the difference between. This is not the difference between liberals and conservatives. This is sort of the difference between a sort of Berlusconi style would-be authoritarian, a sort of banana republic kind of politician, than your mainstream liberal or conservative, of which the rest of the politicians in this race are.
Okay, there is so much more to talk to you about. I'm just grabbed by the clock. Jonathan Tobin, it is always a joy speaking with you and hearing your take on any issue, certainly issues of Jewish concern and politics. I thank you so much for always sharing your thoughts with us on JBS. I wish you all the best, Jonathan, in your wonderful work at Commentary. We'll speak again soon.
Great to be with you. Thanks,
Thank you. Jonathan Tobin, the senior online editor of Commentary Magazine, says a great deal. My thanks, as always, to Sloan Copeland, our director, Serge Goldberg, production coordinator, to our editor, Dennis Golan, the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producer of Election 2016, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.